Move!
The single word cut through the cheerful music drifting from the grand ballroom. Lady Eglantine Vaymont slowly turned around. Standing behind her, and surrounded by admiring young ladies, was her younger sister, Lady Lucasta Vaymont.
Move back, or the guests might see you.
Eglantine lowered her eyes.
Father said I wasn't allowed inside. He never said I couldn't stand out here.
Lucasta smiled. It was the same beautiful smile that charmed noblemen and wounded her sister.
Don't make me repeat myself.
She stepped closer until only inches separated them.
Move.
Eglantine looked toward the towering ballroom doors.
I only wanted to hear the music. Music? Don't flatter yourself, Eglantine. You're not missing the ball. The ball is missing you.
What?
Eglantine frowned, not understanding. Lucasta's smile widened.
Because if Father allowed you inside, every ambitious mother would drag her daughter home before she caught your appetite instead of a husband.
A few nearby ladies covered their mouths to hide their laughter. Eglantine remained silent. She had heard worse. Lucasta adjusted the diamond necklace around her neck.
You've been chubby since the day you were born. Mother used to call you adorable. The rest of the kingdom simply calls you unfortunate.
Before Eglantine could answer, thunderous applause erupted from inside the ballroom. Lucasta's eyes lit up.
He's here. The wealthiest bachelor in the kingdom had finally arrived.
Instantly, every ambitious mother gathered her daughter and hurried toward the entrance. Lucasta didn't spare her sister another glance. Inside the ballroom, the crowd parted. Duke Peregrine Arden entered with calm, measured steps. Within seconds, the first noblewoman blocked his path.
Your Grace, my daughter has embroidered since she was 5, speaks 4 languages, plays the piano beautifully, and has never embarrassed our family.
Peregrine listened politely.
Remarkable. If I ever decide to collect accomplishments instead of choosing a wife, I'll know exactly where to find you.
An awkward silence swept through the hall. Before anyone could recover, another mother hurried forward.
Your Grace, perhaps just one dance with my daughter.
Peregrine looked at the young lady, then at her mother.
Does she always require permission to speak? Or only when she's standing beside you?
Even a few gentlemen struggled to hide their smiles. Peregrine quietly exhaled. Another perfect daughter, another rehearsed speech, another evening pretending people wanted him when all they truly wanted was his fortune. Without another word, he slipped out through the side doors in search of fresh air, completely unaware that before the night was over, he would meet the one woman in the entire kingdom who wasn't trying to win his heart. She was only trying to steal a slice of cake. If you enjoy emotional Duke and Duchess stories filled with unforgettable twists, don't forget to subscribe before we continue. And when you've watched this story to the very end, come back and rate it from 1 to 10 in the comments. I'd love to know where this one ranks among your favorites. Now, let's begin where fate quietly changed everything. Lady Eglantine Vaymont entered the world with a loud cry and cheeks so wonderfully round that the elderly midwife couldn't help but laugh. "What a healthy little lady," she said, placing the newborn into Lady Honoria Vaymont's trembling arms. "I've delivered many noble children, Your Grace, but I've never seen one arrive with so much life." Honoria kissed her daughter's forehead. "She's perfect." Standing beside the bed, Duke Wulfric Vaymont stared quietly at his firstborn. He forced a smile for his exhausted wife, but when he stepped outside the room, one of the maids innocently whispered to another, "The little lady is rather chubby." The Duke heard it. He never forgot it. Years later, when Eglantine was only 13, illness stole the only person who had ever looked at her without judgment. As Honoria struggled to catch her final breath, she gently squeezed her daughter's hand. Never let anyone convince you that your heart is worth less than your face." Those became the last words Eglantine ever heard from her mother. Nothing inside Vaymont Manor felt the same again. "Lady Eglantine!" The sharp voice of the housekeeper echoed through the corridor. "The family portrait is ready." Eglantine's face brightened. She hurried upstairs after carefully smoothing the simple blue dress she'd secretly spent weeks sewing herself. She stopped outside the drawing room, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The grand room was filled with sunlight. The famous portrait painter stood before a massive canvas, while Duke Wulfric, Lord Valerian, and Lady Lucasta took their places. The painter looked around politely. "My lord, your eldest daughter?" Before Eglantine could answer, the Duke calmly adjusted his gloves. "Leave her out." The room fell silent. The painter blinked. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace? The portrait is for visitors." The words landed harder than a slap. Eglantine felt every servant in the room glance toward her before quickly lowering their eyes. She forced a smile that fooled no one. I understand, Father." She quietly turned around and walked out before anyone could see the tears gathering in her eyes. The portrait remained hanging in the manor for years. Every visitor admired the perfect Vaymont family. Only Eglantine knew someone had been painted out long before the brush ever touched the canvas. The following morning, breakfast was served in the grand dining hall. Fresh bread, roasted meats, and sweet pastries covered the long table. Eglantine hesitated before taking the empty chair furthest from everyone else. Lucasta looked up from her tea. "Father?" The Duke folded his newspaper. "Yes?" "Should sister really be eating here today?" Eglantine froze. Wulfric slowly looked across the table. His eyes rested on his firstborn for only a moment. "Where she eats is unimportant, as long as it isn't where my guests might lose their appetite." No one laughed. That somehow hurt even more. Without saying a word, Eglantine stood. "I wasn't very hungry anyway." She carried her untouched plate from the room. The servants watched helplessly as she disappeared into the kitchen. Old Mrs. Bramble, the head cook, quietly placed a warm meat pie in front of her. "You'll waste away if you keep lying like that." Eglantine looked down at the pie and laughed through watery eyes. "I don't think anyone has ever accused me of wasting away." Mrs. Bramble smiled. "Then prove them right by eating." For a few precious minutes, the kitchen felt more like home than the manor ever had. Later that afternoon, Lord Valerian was practicing with his fencing instructor in the courtyard. Eglantine paused to watch. "You're getting much better," she called with genuine admiration. Valerian lowered his sword and walked towards her. "I've been thinking," she smiled. "About what?" "When I inherit Father's title, I'll have a small cottage built." Her eyes brightened. "You would?" "Of course." He pointed beyond the estate gates. "Far enough away that visitors won't know we're related." He walked away before she could answer. The smile slowly disappeared from her face. Just as she turned to leave, the butler hurried across the courtyard carrying a sealed letter. "My lord!" The Duke opened the wax seal. His serious expression suddenly changed. A rare smile appeared. "Prepare the ball hall." Servants stopped what they were doing. "The grand autumn ball will be held in 3 days." Excited whispers spread through the estate. Then the Duke announced the reason. "Duke Peregrine Arden, the wealthiest bachelor in the kingdom, has accepted my invitation." The entire manor erupted with excitement. Only Eglantine remained silent. Experience had already taught her one painful lesson. Whenever House Vaymont celebrated, there was never a place for her. The Grand Autumn Ball transformed Vaymont Manor into the center of the kingdom's attention. Golden chandeliers illuminated the magnificent ballroom, while an orchestra filled the air with graceful melodies. Every influential family had accepted Duke Wulfric Vaimont's invitation for one reason alone: Duke Peregrine Ardyn. The wealthiest bachelor in the kingdom had finally accepted an invitation after refusing countless social gatherings. The moment he entered the ballroom, conversations stopped. Before he had taken 3 steps, a finely dressed noblewoman blocked his path.
Your Grace, my daughter has embroidered since she was 5, speaks 4 languages, plays the piano beautifully and has never embarrassed our family.
Peregrine listened
Remarkable.
patiently. Remarkable. The mother smiled with satisfaction. He inclined his head politely. If I ever decide to collect accomplishments instead of choosing a wife, I'll remember exactly where to find you. A ripple of awkward laughter spread through the room. The woman stepped aside, her smile completely gone. Unfortunately, another mother immediately replaced her. My daughter has been admired by every noble family in the county. Another interrupted before he could answer. My daughter has rejected 6 marriage proposals. A third proudly announced, my daughter is considered the greatest beauty in the kingdom. Peregrine quietly closed his eyes for a brief moment. Every conversation sounded exactly the same. Every mother believed her daughter was extraordinary. Every daughter smiled exactly as she had been instructed. None of them spoke for themselves. Across the ballroom, Duke Wulfric Vaimont proudly introduced Lucasta Vaimont to distinguished guests. She carried herself with perfect elegance, convinced the evening belonged to her. Peregrine finally excused himself. "If you'll forgive me," he said, "I find myself in desperate need of fresh air." Without waiting for another introduction, he slipped through the terrace doors and into the moonlit gardens. The cool evening breeze immediately eased the headache forming behind his eyes. He loosened his cravat and let out a slow breath. At last. Then, "No, no, don't fall." A nervous whisper drifted through the silence. Peregrine turned toward the sound. Outside the manor's kitchen stood a young woman balancing rather unsteadily on an old wooden barrel beneath an open window. Half her body disappeared inside as she stretched toward a plate resting on the windowsill. Just a little closer. Her fingertips brushed the plate. The barrel shifted. Oh no! She lunged forward, grabbed the enormous slice of cake, and hugged it triumphantly against her chest. Unfortunately, the barrel rolled away beneath her feet. She jumped to the ground with surprising agility, protecting the cake far more carefully than herself. "I meant to do that." Peregrine folded his arms. "I admire your priorities." The young woman froze. Slowly, very slowly, she turned around. The smile disappeared from her face. Standing only a few steps away was the wealthiest bachelor in the kingdom. Neither of them spoke. She looked at him, then at the cake, then back at him again. Finally, she sighed. "If you're going to report me," she lifted the plate slightly, "would you at least let me finish one slice first?" Peregrine stared at her for another heartbeat. Then, for the first time that evening, he laughed. A genuine laugh, not the polite smile he'd offered inside the ballroom, an honest one. "You are stealing dessert from your own father's banquet." "Borrowing," she corrected. "I fully intend to return the plate." "And the cake?" "I'm afraid that part cannot be recovered." His smile widened. "I suspected as much." She rested against the stone wall. "I wasn't invited." "Yet this is your home." "It belongs to my father." She looked down at the cake. "I merely live here." There was no self-pity in her voice, only quiet acceptance. "You could have asked the servants. They already knew." She smiled faintly. "They're the ones who left it on the windowsill." That answer surprised him. "They seem rather fond of you." "They're the only people who notice when I haven't eaten." Silence settled comfortably between them. After a moment, Peregrine asked, "Tell me something. If tomorrow every door in this kingdom opened for you, what would you choose?" She didn't hesitate. "To leave?" No jewels? No. No title. I already have one. No wealthy husband. She smiled. A husband is simply a house if he isn't kind. He studied her carefully. So what exactly would freedom look like? She considered the question. Somewhere nobody introduces me as the daughter they're ashamed of. The answer lingered between them. Then she looked at him with unexpected curiosity. And you? He gave a dry laugh. One evening when no one tried to marry me before asking my name. She nodded thoughtfully. That sounds fixable. Oh? You need a wife. I need an escape. She shrugged. A contract would solve both problems. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to Duke Peregrine Arden as though he were simply another person, not the wealthiest bachelor in the kingdom, not a prize, not an opportunity, just a man. Hidden behind a marble column near the terrace, Lucasta stopped in her tracks. She had followed Peregrine into the gardens, hoping to finally have him to herself. Instead, she watched him laughing with the one sister she had spent her entire life convincing everyone was impossible to love. For the first time that evening, Lucasta felt something she had never imagined she could feel toward Eglantine. Fear. Peregrine looked at Eglantine for a long moment before speaking. You've given me an unusual solution to an unusual problem. She smiled faintly. I've been told unusual suits me. He almost laughed again. I don't make important decisions in gardens. Neither do I, she replied. This one simply happened to begin here. He nodded. I'll think about what you've said. And if I decide your proposal deserves another conversation, I'll let you know. She bowed politely. That's more than I expected. As Peregrine turned to leave, Lucasta stepped out from behind the marble pillar. So that's your plan? Eglantine blinked. I don't know what you mean. Lucasta folded her arms. You couldn't compete with me inside the ballroom, so you waited outside for him. It wasn't like that. No? Lucasta glanced toward the path Peregrine had just taken. I've spent weeks preparing for tonight, and somehow you managed to steal the only conversation that mattered. I didn't steal anything. You've been stealing attention your entire life simply by making people pity you. Eglantine's expression remained calm. I've never wanted anyone's pity. Lucasta stepped closer. Then stay away from him. I wasn't following him. I don't care who followed whom. Her voice hardened. The next Duchess of Arden will be me. Eglantine sighed softly. You've already decided that. I don't decide it. Lucasta smiled confidently. It's simply the obvious outcome. Without waiting for another reply, she turned and disappeared back into the ballroom. Eglantine looked down at the empty plate still in her hands. The evening had become far more complicated than a stolen slice of cake. The following morning, Peregrine left Vaimont Manor earlier than expected. Instead of returning directly to his estate, he stopped throughout the village surrounding the Duke's lands. He had learned long ago that servants often spoke more honestly than nobles. At the bakery, an elderly woman smiled when Eglantine's name was mentioned. Lady Eglantine, she pays for bread every winter so poor families never go hungry. At the blacksmith's workshop, the owner chuckled. She's the only noble who remembers my wife's birthday. Near the stables, one of the grooms shook his head. Her father barely notices us. Lady Eglantine knows every horse by name. Even the children gathering flowers outside the church recognized her immediately. The kind lady? She always fixes our toys. She taught me how to read. She visits old Mrs. Hensley every Sunday. Every answer surprised Peregrine. Inside noble society, Eglantine was spoken of as though she were an embarrassment. Outside it, she was admired. By the time he reached his carriage, his decision had already been made. 2 days later, Duke Wulfric welcomed Peregrine into his study with unmistakable excitement. "I had hoped you returned to discuss Lucasta." Peregrine remained standing. "I've returned to request permission to marry your eldest daughter." The room fell completely silent. The Duke stared at him, then laughed. When Peregrine's expression didn't change, the laughter faded. "This is hardly amusing." "I agree. You cannot possibly mean Eglantine." "I do." Wulfric slowly rose from his chair. "My daughter has somehow entertained you, and now you wish to mock my family." "I mock no one." "Then explain yourself." "I intend to marry Lady Eglantine Vaimont under a 1-year contract." The Duke slammed both hands onto his desk. "My eldest daughter has never received a proposal in her life, and now the richest duke in the kingdom arrives asking for her? You expect me to believe this is genuine?" Before Peregrine could answer, the study door opened. Lucasta, carrying fresh tea, entered. She stopped the moment she heard Eglantine's name. "I'm sorry, I must have misunderstood." Peregrine answered calmly. "You heard correctly." The tray slipped from Lucasta's hands. Porcelain shattered across the floor. "No," she whispered. "No, you came here for me." Peregrine looked at her politely. "I came here for Lady Eglantine." Outside the study, Valerian had heard enough. He entered without knocking. "This marriage is ridiculous." He looked directly at Peregrine. "My sister won't survive a year as your wife. That possibility concerns me." "So you admit it?" Peregrine met his eyes. "No, I simply believe every marriage deserves honesty before confidence." The answer left Valerian speechless. News spread through the kingdom before sunset. The richest bachelor alive had ignored every celebrated beauty to ignore the daughter many believed no man would ever choose. Some called it madness. Others believed it was a political game. No one understood the truth, not even Eglantine herself. When the engagement was officially announced that evening, Eglantine looked across the crowded hall towards Peregrine. He offered only the smallest nod. It wasn't a promise of love. It was simply the beginning of an agreement that neither of them realized would change their lives forever. The wedding of Duke Peregrine Ardine and Lady Eglantine Vaimont became the greatest mystery the kingdom had discussed in decades. Some believed the wealthy duke had lost a wager. Others insisted the marriage was a clever political arrangement. The cruelest rumor claimed he had chosen her only because no beautiful woman had accepted him. Neither bride nor groom bothered correcting anyone. The ceremony itself was simple. There were no lingering glances, no whispered promises, no declarations of love. When the vows were finished, Peregrine simply offered his arm. "Shall we go home, Your Grace?" Eglantine looked at him for a second before placing her hand on his arm. Home. The word sounded unfamiliar. After all, she had never truly had one. Upon arriving at Ardine Manor, the servants lined both sides of the entrance. Many secretly exchanged curious looks. They had expected the kingdom's richest duke to marry a breathtaking beauty. Instead, they watched a cheerful, chubby young woman smile warmly at each of them. Rather than walking past, Eglantine stopped. "Before anything else," she looked at the elderly butler, "you've been standing in the sun waiting for us. I'm terribly sorry. You should all go inside before welcoming me." The servants looked at one another in surprise. No duchess had ever apologized to them before. Over the following days, Eglantine quietly learned each servant's name. She remembered who had children, whose wife was expecting a baby, whose father was ill. She thanked maids for their work instead of simply giving orders. Within 2 weeks, the entire household had stopped referring to her as the new Duchess. They simply called her our Duchess. Peregrine noticed the change. One afternoon, he found the kitchen unusually cheerful. "What happened here?" The head cook smiled. "Her Grace. She asked us why we looked so exhausted." Peregrine raised an eyebrow. "And?" She discovered we prepare 3 different dinners every evening, one for guests, one for senior servants, one for junior servants. Eglantine realized nearly half the food was being thrown away. She suggested combining the meals while improving the recipes. Now everyone eats together after the guests leave. Nothing is wasted. Peregrine nodded thoughtfully. The previous steward had never questioned the system. She had solved it in a single morning. A week later, another problem found its way to her. While reviewing household expenses, Eglantine noticed the estate had purchased almost twice as much lamp oil as neighboring ducal households, despite using fewer lanterns. Rather than accusing anyone of theft, she spent 2 evenings quietly walking through the manor after sunset. On the 3rd night, she found the answer. Several old storage rooms remained brightly lit until dawn every night. Not because anyone worked there, but because broken valves inside the imported oil lamps caused them to burn continuously. The expensive lamps had been praised as a luxury improvement years earlier. No one had realized they were quietly wasting a fortune. She recommended replacing them with simpler, locally made lanterns. Within a month, household expenses fell dramatically. When Peregrine reviewed the financial reports, he frowned. There must be a mistake. There isn't, his accountant replied. Her Grace found the reason. Peregrine looked toward the gardens where Eglantine was helping a frightened stable boy calm an injured foal. You noticed all that? Later that evening, he asked her directly. She smiled. I notice people first. The lamps simply happened to be nearby. For the first time, Peregrine found himself studying his wife differently. Everyone else had looked at her appearance. He was beginning to understand her greatest beauty had nothing to do with her face. She observed what others overlooked. She solved problems without seeking praise. Most importantly, people trusted her. Meanwhile, back at Vaimont Manor, Lucasta refused to accept reality. Whenever ladies gathered for afternoon tea, Lucasta spoke confidently. The marriage won't survive the year. Someone asked why. Lucasta smiled. It was a contract. You cannot build a lifetime from paperwork. Another lady hesitated. But they seem happy. Lucasta laughed softly. They're pretending. My sister has finally escaped father's house. Peregrine merely solved a temporary inconvenience. She leaned closer. When the agreement ends, he'll realize what everyone else already knows. No wealthy duke remains married to a woman like Eglantine. The rumor spread quickly through noble society. Unfortunately for Lucasta, none of them ever reached Ardeen Manor, because inside those walls, something neither contract nor gossip could predict had quietly begun. Respect. And from respect, the smallest seed of love had started to grow, though neither Peregrine nor Eglantine had noticed it yet.
Months passed, and the kingdom never grew tired of discussing the strange marriage between Duke Peregrine Arden and Duchess Eglantine Arden. Some insisted the Duke merely tolerated his wife until their contract expired. Others confidently predicted he would soon replace her with a younger, prettier noblewoman. Whenever those rumors reached Eglantine, she simply smiled and continued with her work. She had never married to win anyone's approval. Back at Vaimont Manor, Lucasta saw every passing day as another chance to prove she was still the greater sister. If Eglantine can become a duchess, imagine the husband a woman like me deserves. The opportunity arrived during Lord Valerian Vaimont's birthday celebration. Noble families from across the kingdom gathered to honor the future Duke of Vaimont. Among the distinguished guests was Duke Hadrian Elmire, a wealthy young nobleman admired for his charm, handsome appearance, and impressive estates. Lucasta wasted no time. Unlike the desperate mothers who had chased Peregrine, she approached Hadrian with confidence. She laughed at his jokes, praised his achievements without sounding rehearsed, and danced with him twice before the evening ended. Hadrian found her beauty impossible to ignore. Within a few months, he asked for her hand in marriage. Lucasta accepted before he had even finished speaking. The wedding was magnificent.
Guests admired her dazzling gowns, jewels glittered around her neck. Newspapers praised the union as the marriage of the season. As her carriage rolled through cheering crowds, Lucasta looked directly toward Eglantine, who had quietly attended as Peregrine's wife. Their eyes met. Lucasta's smile said everything. She believed she had won. After all, Hadrian was handsome, respected, and incredibly wealthy. Surely she had made the better choice. Life at Elmere House quickly became exactly what she had always dreamed of. Every week brought another banquet, another expensive gown, another jeweled necklace, another opportunity to impress high society. She surrounded herself with fashionable ladies who admired luxury as much as she did. To Lucasta, appearances meant everything. Meanwhile, life inside Arden Manor remained surprisingly ordinary. Eglantine spent her mornings walking through the estate with the gardeners, afternoons reviewing household accounts, and evenings visiting the servants' quarters whenever someone became ill. She never considered any task beneath her dignity. One rainy afternoon, Peregrine found her kneeling on the stable floor, gently wrapping a bandage around the injured leg of an elderly hunting dog everyone else believed should simply be put down. "You'll ruin your dress," he said. She smiled without looking up. "The dog doesn't seem to mind. It isn't worth much anymore." She carefully tightened the bandage. "I wasn't aware kindness depended on market value." Peregrine found himself speechless. Another afternoon, he noticed one of the youngest kitchen maids crying alone behind the pantry. Before he could ask what had happened, Eglantine was already sitting beside the frightened girl. She listened quietly for several minutes before removing a small silver hairpin from her own hair. "This belonged to my mother." The maid immediately shook her head. "I couldn't possibly accept something so precious." "You're not." Eglantine gently placed it into her hand. "You're borrowing courage. When you no longer need it, give it back." The young maid smiled through her tears. Peregrine watched the entire exchange from the doorway without interrupting. That evening, he remained alone in his study long after sunset. His eyes drifted toward the contract resting inside the drawer of his desk. Months earlier, it had seemed the perfect solution, a practical arrangement between two strangers, nothing more. Now, he realized something had quietly changed. He looked forward to breakfast because she would be there. The manor felt strangely empty whenever she visited neighboring villages. Servants laughed more, guests stayed longer. Even he smiled more often than he once had. None of those things happened because she was beautiful. They happened because she made everyone around her feel valued. For the first time in his life, Peregrine questioned a decision he had made with pure logic. He slowly removed the folded contract from the drawer. His eyes rested on the signatures at the bottom of the page. Then, without saying a word to anyone, he placed the document into the fireplace. The flames quietly consumed every page until nothing remained but ashes. Standing alone before the fire, Peregrine finally admitted the truth he had been avoiding. Somewhere between a stolen slice of cake and countless ordinary days, he had fallen deeply in love with the one woman the rest of the kingdom had never truly seen. The first year of Lucasta Elmire's marriage looked exactly as she had imagined. She attended the kingdom's finest banquets, dressed in gowns embroidered with silver thread. Rare jewels arrived almost monthly from merchants hoping to earn Duke Hadrian Elmire's favor. Every ballroom welcomed her with admiration, and every conversation revolved around her beauty. Whenever someone mentioned Eglantine, Lucasta smiled with quiet satisfaction. "My sister chose security," she would say. "I chose happiness." No one challenged her. From the outside, she appeared to have everything. Then, almost without warning, Duke Hadrian's fortunes began to unravel. A trusted business partner disappeared after persuading him to finance an ambitious overseas shipping venture. 3 merchant vessels carrying expensive cargo vanished during violent storms before reaching port. Several large loans were called in at the same time, while poor harvests on two of his estates reduced the income he had expected to cover his growing debts. Within months, the lavish spending that once seemed effortless became impossible to maintain. One by one, servants were dismissed. The orchestra that entertained their dinner guests was let go. Jewels disappeared from Lucasta's dressing table, quietly sold to satisfy impatient creditors. The grand parties stopped. Lucasta refused to accept the new reality. "This is temporary," she insisted whenever Hadrian spoke of reducing expenses. "It has to be." Hadrian worked tirelessly from sunrise until long after midnight, meeting accountants, negotiating with creditors, and searching for ways to protect what remained of his estates. Instead of standing beside her husband, Lucasta grew increasingly resentful. She no longer admired the man she had married. She only saw the fortune he had lost. At another noble gathering, she met Lord Cedric Marlowe, a wealthy widower whose fortune had grown while others struggled. He admired Lucasta openly. He praised her beauty. He showered her with attention she felt Hadrian no longer had time to give. At first, she convinced herself the conversations were harmless. Soon, secret meetings replaced innocent conversations. She began inventing excuses to leave home, claiming she was visiting old friends or attending charitable committees. The servants noticed. Unfortunately for Lucasta, so did Hadrian's elderly valet. One rainy afternoon, the old servant quietly handed his master a folded letter he had found tucked inside Lucasta's writing desk. It contained plans for another secret meeting. Hadrian read every word. He said nothing. 3 evenings later, Lucasta arrived at Lord Marlowe's country residence, believing they would spend another carefree afternoon together. Instead, the drawing-room doors opened to reveal Duke Hadrian standing silently beside Lord Marlowe. Neither man looked angry. Disappointment filled the room far more heavily than shouting ever could. Lucasta's face drained of color. "Hadrian." He slowly placed the letter onto the table between them. "I gave you my name, my home, my trust. You valued none of them." For the first time since their marriage, Lucasta found herself without an answer. The scandal spread across the kingdom before sunrise. High society, once eager to welcome the beautiful Duchess of Elmia, suddenly found reasons to decline every invitation she sent. Ladies who had once competed for her friendship crossed the street rather than greet her. The same people who admired her beauty now whispered behind fans as she passed. Within a fortnight, Hadrian formally ended the marriage. Lucasta left Elmire House, carrying only the belongings that legally belonged to her before the wedding. The magnificent carriage that had once announced her arrival at every social event was replaced by a modest coach, returning her to Vaimont Manor. As the carriage rolled through the estate gates, she stared at the familiar house she had once been so desperate to leave behind. The front door opened. Duke Wulfric stood waiting. Not with comfort, not with welcome, only silent disappointment. For the first time in her life, Lucasta understood something her sister had learned earlier. Beauty may open the grandest doors in the kingdom, but only character gives anyone a reason to keep them open.
Nearly 2 years had passed since Eglantine left Vaimont Manor. In all that time, she had never once returned. Not because she carried hatred in her heart, but because no one had invited her home. While Arden Manor flourished under her careful management, House Vaimont quietly began to crumble. For years, Duke Wulfric ignored repairs to tenant farms, while spending lavishly on extravagant banquets meant to impress the nobility. Valerian continued the same habit after taking charge of much of the estate's affairs. Instead of investing in the land that fed the estate, he poured enormous sums into ambitious horse-breeding ventures that failed one after another. When the harvest proved poorer than expected, everything collapsed at once. Creditors arrived almost daily. Suppliers refused further deliveries. Several long-time servants quietly accepted work elsewhere because their wages had gone unpaid for months. The once magnificent Vaymont estate slowly lost the pride it had spent generations building. One rainy morning, Valerian placed another unpaid invoice onto his father's desk. "We can't keep pretending this will fix itself." Wulfric rubbed his tired eyes. "I know. There is only one family wealthy enough to help us." Silence filled the study. Neither man wanted to speak the name. Finally, Valerian did. "Eglantine." The Duke looked away. "I have no right to ask her." "No," Valerian answered quietly. "We don't." 2 days later, their carriage stopped outside Arden Manor. Neither man spoke during the journey. Pride had made the road feel much longer than it truly was. When the butler announced their arrival, Eglantine came into the drawing room carrying a basket of freshly picked flowers. She stopped in surprise. "Father." Her eyes shifted towards Valerian. "Brother." Neither man could meet her gaze. For the first time in years, Duke Wulfric looked smaller than she remembered. Age and worry had stolen much of the confidence he once carried so proudly. He struggled to find the words. His voice failed him. Valerian stepped forward instead. "We need help." There was no excuse, no attempt to justify the past, only honesty. Eglantine quietly invited them to sit. Tea was served. No one touched it. Finally, Wulfric spoke. "I spent years believing strength meant never admitting failure. I was wrong. Our estate is drowning. We've lost good people because of my decisions. I came prepared for you to refuse us." Eglantine listened without interrupting. When he finished, she remained silent for several moments. Then she asked one question. "What about the tenants?" Valerian frowned. "What do you mean?" "The families who work your land, the servants, the stable boys, the widows who depend on the estate. Who is helping them?" Neither man answered. That silence told her everything. Later that evening, she found Peregrine reading in the library. "My father came today." "I heard." "He asked for help." Peregrine closed his book. "And what do you think?" She walked towards the window overlooking the gardens. "I don't want to rescue father's pride. I don't want to reward my brother's mistakes." She looked back at him. "But the truth is, innocent people shouldn't lose their homes because those in charge failed them." Peregrine smiled gently. "That's exactly why I married you." She blinked. "You'll help." "I'll help because you asked." Within days, Arden accountants arrived at Vaymont Manor. They reorganized debts, negotiated with creditors, and restored wages for the servants before addressing anything else. Repairs began on neglected tenant cottages. Fields were replanted. The estate slowly breathed again. Throughout the process, Eglantine never once reminded anyone how they had treated her. She simply worked. One evening, Valerian found her alone in the gardens, inspecting newly planted roses. He stood awkwardly beside her. "I owe you something." She continued trimming a damaged stem. "You owe many people many things." He gave a weak smile. "I know." Another silence followed. "When we were children, I spent years trying to convince myself you embarrassed this family." He looked down at his hands. "The truth is, I embarrassed myself. I mistook arrogance for strength. I mistook pride for leadership. And I forgot the first duty of a brother." His voice trembled. "I'm sorry, Eglantine. I should have protected you. I became another person you needed protection from." Tears filled his eyes. For the first time in years, Eglantine saw not the cruel young man who had mocked her, but a broken one trying to become better. She gently placed a hand on his arm. "It's all right." She paused before speaking the word she hadn't used since her mother died. "Brother." Valerian closed his eyes. That single word hurt more and healed more than anything else she could have said. The seasons changed, But Arden Manor remained filled with the warmth Eglantine had quietly created. Servants laughed openly as they worked. Children from the tenant villages often
What a
visited the
lovely day,
gardens,
my dears.
knowing the
Lady
Duchess
Eglantine, I
always
made
had
these
time
for
to
you.
listen
Oh,
to
they're
their
beautiful.
stories.
Thank you, darling.
Even
And I saw
merchants
a
preferred
rabbit in the
doing
hedge.
business
A
with
rabbit,
Arden
do tell
Manor
me more.
because everyone knew a promise made by Duchess Eglantine would always be
Pleasure, Lady
honored.
Eglantine.
Meanwhile,
Trust is
Vaimont
mutual,
Manor
sir.
slowly recovered.
Your word
The
is
estate
enough
no
for
longer
us.
struggled to
Thank
pay
you.
its
A
workers.
promise is
The
enough.
fields produced healthy harvests again.
My lord, the harvest looks
Valerian
promising, but the
managed the
rains
estate
worry us.
differently
I
now.
understand. Let's do
Instead
the
of chasing
irrigation. Repairs are
prestige,
underway,
he
my
walked
lord. It will
through the
hold.
villages
Excellent work.
himself,
The estate
listening
thrives with
to the
you. Thank you, my
concerns
lord.
of farmers and craftsmen. Many people noticed the change. Few knew who had inspired it. Lucasta's life moved in the opposite direction. After the scandal surrounding her divorce, every invitation she sent was politely declined. Ladies who once begged for her company suddenly remembered urgent appointments elsewhere. Gentlemen who once competed for a single dance barely acknowledged her presence. She spent most of her days staring through the windows of Vaimont Manor, watching carriages pass without ever stopping. For the first time in her life, beauty alone could no longer open the doors she had once taken for granted. One quiet afternoon, Duke Wulfric arrived at Arden Manor without announcing his visit. He expected formal greetings. Instead, he found something entirely different. Children were chasing each other across the gardens, laughing freely. Several servants paused their work long enough to greet Eglantine with genuine smiles. An elderly gardener proudly showed her the first roses of the season. She admired every bloom as though it were the finest flower in the kingdom. No one seemed afraid of her. No one lowered their heads when she approached. They respected her because they wanted to, not because they had to. Wulfric remained standing beneath an old oak tree, silently watching the daughter he had spent years refusing to see. Only now did he understand something that had escaped him for decades. People were naturally drawn toward Eglantine, not because she possessed extraordinary beauty, not because she held enormous wealth. They loved her because she made everyone around her feel important. It was a gift no title could purchase. Eglantine eventually noticed him. "Father." Her voice carried neither anger nor resentment, only quiet surprise. She walked toward him. "I wasn't expecting visitors." For a long moment, Wulfric could not speak. His eyes wandered across the estate one final time. "I've been watching." She waited patiently. "I finally understand." He laughed softly, though tears already filled his eyes. "All those years, I thought I was protecting my family's reputation. I measured every person by appearance. I believed beauty would secure our future." He lowered his head. "I spent years searching for value in the wrong places." His voice broke, "and because of that, I failed my own daughter." The words he had carried for so many years finally escaped. "I'm sorry, Eglantine. I cannot return your childhood. I cannot erase what I allowed to happen. But if there is any forgiveness left in your heart, I don't deserve it, yet I am asking anyway." Silence settled between them. Eglantine looked at the man before her. He no longer resembled the proud duke who had excluded her from family portraits or sent her away from his table. He looked like an old father carrying the weight of his own mistakes. She gently reached for his trembling hands. "I forgave you long before you asked." He looked up in disbelief. "I didn't forgive you because you deserved it. I forgave you because I refused to let bitterness become the story of my life." Tears rolled freely down Wulfric's face. For the first time in many years, he embraced his daughter. Not because she had become a duchess, not because she had saved his estate, but because he had finally learned to see the child Honoria had loved from the very beginning. Several days later, Eglantine visited the small cemetery where her mother rested. She knelt beside the weathered headstone and carefully arranged a bouquet of white roses. A gentle breeze moved through the trees.
She smiled softly. You were right, Mother. They looked at my face for years, but in the end, it was my heart they finally remembered. She remained there quietly until another hand slipped gently into hers. Peregrine had joined her without making a sound. He looked at the flowers before turning toward his wife. I burned our contract months ago. She blinked in surprise. I know. His eyebrows lifted. You knew? She laughed softly. The fireplace smelled like burnt parchment for days. For the first time in years, they both laughed together. Peregrine lifted her hand and held it firmly. Then allow me to ask properly. This time, without contracts, without conditions, without an ending. I love you, Eglantine. I always will. She smiled through happy tears. I know. Hand in hand, they walked away from the cemetery towards the peaceful life they had built together. Far behind them stood the cold memories of the house where Eglantine had once believed she would never belong. Ahead of them waited a home where she had always been enough.